In January 2023, Tortoise and Sky News created the Westminster accounts. It was the first fully searchable database of the money being used to oil the machinery of British politics. In this bonus episode of the news meeting, we're going to look back at the Westminster accounts, what we learnt and what we hope to learn still. I'm James Harding, I'm the editor of Tortoise, and I'm joined here by Sam Coates, who's the deputy political editor of Sky News, our own political editor, Cat Neilan, and the data scientist who put the whole project together, Joe White. I'm going to start, if I might, Sam, with you. How much does money matter in British politics?
Hello, James. It's really easy to just say things like money is the lifeblood of our politics. It's kind of like handy cliche. I think we used that quite a lot when we rolled out the Westminster accounts. But I think actually it's interesting to look at why. First of all, because our political system today requires an awful lot of it. Caps of tens and tens and tens of millions of pounds. That's the amount that's spent by each political party in election year in order to fund staff, campaigning literature, adverts. So you just need a high amount in order to run an election campaign or an election year. And I think that the question of money is going to be particularly pertinent in 2024. And aside from the sums, I think it's also interesting because the people that give money become a big focus of attention for politicians. Donors have a special status in our political system, not just because we're interested in them, but because politicians often pay great heed to what they are doing and saying. I'll just give you a couple of examples. It really was when the donors started turning off or turning against both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, in amongst all the other things that were going on. But that was when you started to feel the sand shifting from beneath both of those former prime ministers' feet. It's probably too trite to say that there is a possible culture of just very straightforwardly buying influence on policy X or policy Z. That's frankly very, very hard to prove or see. But you do have a kind of constellation, a sort of ecosystem of people with disproportionate weight in their views, and that has a big impact on our politicians.
But did it change your view, Sam? Because I suppose I've often thought about money in politics, and I suspect my prejudice about it is rooted in a view of American politics, where the sums are so large, but then of course they have political advertising, so they just churn through billions of dollars in their political culture. In some ways, when I looked at the Westminster accounts, one of the things I thought was the sums are small. British politics is much more viable and viable by a relatively small group of people or a few individuals. Did it change the way in which you think about money in politics overall?
I think it reinforced what I thought already. I think what matters isn't almost the attitude of the donors or the size, in some cases, the size of the giving. What matters is the attitude of the politicians to that donor. That's what it's all about. Is what we're trying to do really is get to the heart of what instinctively as journalists we have a curiosity about, which is, why do people give to political parties? What do they think they get out of it? What do they really get out of it, if anything at all? And I find all kind of different combinations of looking at that question interesting. And yes, I think there is definitely something in your point that some of the sums that we have been talking about have been lower than the ones in American politics. But one of the things that came to light through the Westminster accounts was that, politicians, MPs were taking risks for what I would regard as comparatively low sums of money, tens of thousands of pounds, £5,000, absurdly low sums of money. They were taking risks, not asking proper questions, not thinking about what that looked like, how that worked. And I think that all the way along, I think politicians do actually put donors on a pedestal, and that's why it's fascinating to go properly into the data that gives us a sort of opens the door to telling us some of the stories that we didn't know before.
Kat, what did you come to think about how much we know about who's giving what?
Well, there are, of course, the vast majority of donors who are individuals who are named, or unions who we all sort of know what they sort of represent and what they're after. But there were a few stories, and there continue to be some entities where it's very difficult to actually get to the bottom of who they are. And that is not just a problem with Parliament. It's a problem with Companies House, which is the sort of foundation that a lot of this is built on. Because if you have a UK company listed on Companies House, you can donate through that entity. But you don't actually have to share much more information than that. And so we found, when we were working on the project with Sky, a couple of quite stark instances. One was a company called IX Wireless, who both Sam and Michelle, our northern correspondent for the period that we did Westminster accounts, went to their stated premises and they were derelict. There was no one there. There was another company called MPM Connect that was donating to Labour MPs. But again, that was the address there was actually, I think, an address for an accountant, not the company itself. And so in both of these instances, what you found was real lack of transparency about who the ultimate donor was. Where does this money really come from? And therefore, to Sam's question about what do they want and what are they actually likely to get, that makes it much more difficult to understand. And I think Joe and I have been looking back to see whether those companies have still been donating this year, and they have. But certainly in the case of IX Wireless, there's another sort of layer of complication around how they're donating. Instead of donating directly to MPs, we found that they've been donating to this newly created company called the Northern Campaign Group, which in turn then donates to MPs. So far, only a fraction of what has been received from IX Wireless through that entity has come into Parliament, but no doubt in the run-up to an election, there'll be more.
Well, it just sits for the moment with this outfit, the Northern Campaign Group.
Yeah, it was 125,000, wasn't it?
Well, let's just figure out exactly how this thing works, Joe. So the Westminster Accounts does what? How do you put it together? Just explain the mechanics.
Yeah, sure. So basically what it's doing is bringing together sort of three separate sets of information about money flowing into politics and sort of trying to sort out that information. So it's fundamentally, it's donations to political parties, which is sort of like, the unions donating to Labour. It's donations, money received by MPs, which comes down to sort of donations for their campaigning. It comes down to sort of second jobs they're taking on, and it comes to sort of gifts and benefits they might receive, like sort of they might get free football tickets or they might get sort of free visits to other countries. And then the last thing is money flowing into APBGs. So for a bit of background, these are all-party parliamentary groups, and you can think of them as sort of special interest groups, cross-party, that sit within Parliament. They're not sort of like select committees, they're sort of more informal, but they're sort of cover everything from, there's an APBG on drones, there's an APBG on cystic fibrosis, and sort of several APBGs for countries. There's actually more APBGs than there are MPs. There's something like 740 of them. And that money can also flow into those to sort of support their operations. And so we built the Westminster accounts to say, well, let's bring all of that together. Let's clean all of this data, because it's not there as a spreadsheet. It's sort of essentially text that we need to sort out and build it into a tool, which means not just reporters, but anyone can use this tool to answer sort of, where are their MPs getting money from? How much time are they spending in sort of second jobs? So how much money they're receiving in second jobs and how much time are they spending, and sort of what external groups are actually putting money in, which was something that was essentially impossible to answer until we did this.
So can we just try and take each of those three things and what we learned? Let's start with donations to political parties. Right. So the drivers of influence, and the presumption is that the big donors have some influence on the politics of those parties. Is that true? Do we think that the people who give get to pull the strings?
I don't think that. I think that's very hard to prove, and that wasn't what we were looking for. in a sense.
No, but it's obviously what the suspicion is. When people see a name or an individual, they think, well, that person is surely pushing some agenda or another. I mean, do you think that's not the case in our politics?
I just think you're asking to prove something that
we can't.
That is all but impossible to prove. But let me give you a sort of adjacent thing of what we did do that I thought told us a story that we didn't know before. It was, and by doing a big data exercise on something like donations, you are just by its very nature spending more time with the information than you would do normally. Normally, as a day-to-day hack, you give it a quick glance. You don't go into these right. But one of the things we stumbled across was the scale of giving to different Labour folk from a company called Ecotricity, and that was Dale Vince, the guy who also funded Just Stop Oil, right? And so on Sky, we put, Dale Vince is, what he said about Just Stop Oil, what he said about the Labour Party, and we went to Wales and interviewed him. And that was the first time that anybody had made the link between what continues to be a very controversial campaign group that the Labour leadership have set itself against, and a very big and prominent donor who was giving directly to Keir Starmer's leadership and directly to the party. That's the kind of story that came up. That became the focus of 7 months of kind of back and forth in the House of Commons. In the end, Dale Vince decided to stick with Labour, stop giving to Just Stop Oil. He seems to have slightly disagreed with where they've ended up on their tactics. Now, your starting point, your question was, did Dale Vince, want something out of Labour? Was he trying to change something? It strikes me that the answer to that is, on balance, from what we could see, no, he wasn't trying to get Labour to modify their position, but he was giving to them because of their position of eventually ending, fossil fuel reliance, as part of our energy system. But was he trying to change Labour's attitude to Just Stop Oil? Well, he didn't seem to attempt to try, and in the end, he made a choice. Right, but therein lay a quite important political story that threaded its way through the year. None of which answers your question, but all of which was worth doing.
But and actually, Sam, what your answer reminds me about the whole project is that we went into it not thinking that the data would give us a bunch of answers, but that it would lead us to a bunch of questions. And actually, it's just worth, Joe, spelling out the searchable nature of this database, because it wasn't just us as journalists at Sky or at Tortoise. The idea was that journalists at a whole bunch of news organisations, and heaven knows they did, really used it. But it was also anyone could, plug in their MP or plug in a potential donor. So can you just explain how the searchable nature of this thing works?
Yeah, so the idea is that you can sort of search it two ways. You can search it from the recipient of the money, or you can search it from the source of the money. So, if you want to know your MP, you can type in your postcode, or you can type in, the name of your MP, and it will give you a big list of all of the donors and sort of summed up how much money they've given, all sort of second jobs. That was already very difficult to do sort of before we did this. The thing that was sort of completely impossible was if you wanted to know from the other side, you wanted to say, how much is, let's say, EcoCity? Is it EcoCity? Sorry. Ecotricity. I want to know sort of how much they're donated to every individual MP. You'd have to go through every single entry for these MPs, and actually every MP has sort of separate documents because they update it 2 weeks. It was essentially impossible. And so what this tool allows you to do is you can search that, and it brings it all in a single place, and you can essentially see sort of the full financial network.
This is the big thing that we did. It wasn't proving or not proving the link between, decisions and donations. It was to present data in a way that they have always stopped us from doing. It was the leaderboards. We created leaderboards of the biggest donors to MPs, the biggest recipients amongst MPs of donations, the biggest donations and funding for APP. It's like, and this is the stuff that they hate, because MPs hate one thing more than anything else, and that's any form of ranking. And that's what we did in spades. Because as journalists, then we go, okay, who's top of the list of highest outside earners? Oh, it was Theresa May. Then it was Boris Johnson. And you start asking questions of that, and it just helps frame the whole debate. But my gosh, MPs will never do that themselves, but we did.
And it also showed us that one of the largest individual donors was the Qatari government, because this was in the run-up to the World Cup. And even though there are lots of rules about money coming from foreign entities, particularly foreign governments, the loopholes provided by APPGs mean that MPs were able to take all expenses paid trips to Qatar, to Doha, ostensibly to see how things were coming together ahead of the World Cup and to make sure that human rights abuses weren't being carried out, but also, oh, thank you very much, I have a 6-star stay in a luxury hotel. And it was about, was it about 300,000 in the end, for the period that we were looking at, which made it a top 5 donor to MPs, or a top 5 source of finances.
And the fact that we live in a political culture where our politicians tell us all the time that we have one of the most transparent parliaments in the world, that our politics is, visible. How does that square with the fact that when you put all the sums together, when you put the numbers together, you see things that you've never seen before? In other words, is it true that our politics is transparent? Is there a difference between transparency and visibility? And if there is it the case that that's because no one in politics really has an interest in making this easily accessible, or is it something a little more pernicious than that? Is it deliberately withheld?
I think there's an element to which that these systems have been built up over a number of years, and therefore they've kind of become labyrinthine just by the nature of how they've come together. That isn't an excuse, and you would think that if Parliament was genuinely committed to transparency, they would have reformed it by now. But the fact that it took Joe and Katie, our other data journalists, so long to get to the bottom of things, and that there were mistakes in the data that they had to correct because the MPs had uploaded it wrongly, just goes to show that it is people were almost blinded by the wealth of data that was there.
Joe, just explain. Kat mentions Katie Riley and you and the team of data journalists and colleagues at Sky. It was quite a gang of people who worked on this. What were you working off? Was it kind of Excel spreadsheets, printouts, website databases? I mean, how much stuff spoke to each other? What was the nature of the data you were dealing with?
It was taken from sort of various sources online, so sort of public data sets, and these are things that sort of MPs have to release, for example, or the Electoral Commission releases it, and it's all separate. And so the task we had was bringing it together. And we experimented with lots of different ways of sort of understanding that data and making it accessible to journalists. And one of the things about this project was we didn't start with a really clear idea of we know exactly what we want and we know exactly how we're going to process it. We sort of started with let's go out and find stuff and sort of throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. But we experimented with lots of different ways. And in the end, for sort of leaderboards, the spreadsheet was ultimately the sort of just ranking things.
No. I understand where we got to in terms of how we might produce, for example, rankings. I'm just intrigued by whether you were working off some things that were PDFs or pieces of paper, some things that were Google Docs, or I guess what I'm trying to understand is why we needed to do this project in the first place, because Parliament could surely say, you know what, we're going to create one place where all the information sits, it all speaks to each other. To a certain extent, we wouldn't need to do this if they did.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think there's not much incentive for them to sort of put it together. As you say, the system's sort of, I don't think it's sort of been deliberately engineered to be sort of obscure, but in practice, it's been built over a number of years. The way MPs record their financial data is not sort of, a set of numbers. It's sort of essentially a dump of text that they update.
I think Joe is massively underselling what he did last year, and Katie and the rest of the team, for this reason. The Register of Members' Financial Interest is not a straightforward document, and it is not a straightforward document for the very clear reasons that MPs have chosen not to make it a straightforward document. Take just one area of outside earnings. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago how much MPs dislike being able to be ranked. So they use every trick in the book to make sure that you can't compare on a like-for-like basis people's outside earnings. So some will report earnings over a time period. Some will report what they get a month, but not say when the months start and when the month's finished. Some will report a range. Some will report retrospectively. Some will stick in figures months after they haven't. Right. All of that is designed so you can't do a league table of the sort that we did, because it means a human being spending ages looking at each entry going, well, I think that kind of little bit of text that once upon a time would have been written in a quill pen actually means that in 2022 they earned this. That was a mammoth job, and it required an awful lot, of risk as well as work, because you were having to make assumptions about what each earnings statement actually meant. And doing that on the scale that we did, people like Joe did, has never been done before because it's such a big piece of work.
And Sam, forgive me, who's your manager if you're an MP? Who do you have to get this report into? Whose job is it to say, I want to make sure all MPs report in the same way to the same timetable so that we can sensibly compare what everyone's doing?
Well, that's a good question, because there are layers and layers of answer to that, which ultimately I'm going to conclude that it's everybody and nobody. So MPs have to report the data about what they're to the registrar, and ultimately that registrar, who has the power to investigate, is only required to collect the data in certain kind of limited and specific ways, and they are allowed to be slightly imprecise about the kind of way that they record the data. And then MPs will say, well, I'm following the rules which are set by MPs, and the ultimate judges of whether or not I've done things in the right way are the constituents who can see what I've declared and will judge it on me every 4 or 5 years at a general election. So by that point, that's what I mean by everybody and nobody. But to come back to an earlier point of yours, this is like the point about what does transparency mean. When you hear a politician talk about transparency, they don't mean it's transparent, so go and look at it. It's, I've put it on a website, and then the bit in brackets is, I'd rather you didn't spend a lot of time working out what it meant, because I'm not clear. And that's the point. It was as much an exercise in forcing us to go and spend some time swimming through this sea of data as anything else. And I spent more time than I ever have done in my career just dealing with both what it said and then what our analysis said in order to paint a series of new pictures that we hadn't done before.
One of those new pictures was around second jobs, because I thought that the numbers said something that surprised me. One of which was that the vast majority of MPs don't earn considerable amounts outside of Parliament, and the other was that a very small number of people earn an incredible amount of money outside of Parliament. Is that a fair read on what the numbers say?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that's that surprising, actually. I think, it was heavily concentrated towards Conservatives. There are a lot of MPs who have professional qualifications, lawyers in general, but also other qualifications, nurses and so on. So there is a certain degree to which they maintain them by working. But, there are some who earn a lot on the speaker circuit, and there are some who are not simply doing it to maintain their professional qualification, but it is, to be honest, it is their first job, not their second job.
And what do you think it does to the perception of politics? Because one of the things that I was struck, and John Riley, when he conceived of this whole project, and Jonathan Levy, now the editor at Sky, and I talked about at the time, was just how people in Westminster talk about sums of money in a way that are completely different from the way in which pretty much every voter thinks about sums of money, And it's not just tens of thousands of pounds, 5,000 of pounds. It's sort of, a few £100 that you may be picking up for doing a telephone interview with a polling company. All of that seems like a lot of money sloshing around and a different attitude to money. Do you think the Westminster accounts made you think differently about the relationship that politicians have and the public have with money?
If I could answer that in a slightly separate way, I mean, I think one of the things that you could see quite quickly, looking at polling, looking at the responses to the Westminster Accounts project, was like such a huge anger that the sums, and we remember from MPs' expenses, it's the small sums as well as the big sums that can cause as much of a row. The test is actually how relatable the issue is to people's normal lives. Right, but for all the anger, I'm interested in where people genuinely kind of place that on their list of priorities when they're, for instance, deciding how they're going to cast their vote at the next election, I'll be interested to set the kind of top earners of outside jobs against the people that are re-elected or re-elected with a significantly cut margin. Is the fact that Theresa May was, top of the charts for quite some time going to have any impact at all on the constituents making a calculation that they might not like it, but in the round they're going to forgive the outside earning because they saw contributions in this parliament that they potentially liked, and therefore they're going to re-elect her as the MP in Maidenhead. It's a complicated algorithm, and I think it's I think there is a initial reaction of people loving to hate politicians doing a lot of things, but I'm then interested in kind of when it actually comes to the ballot box, kind of people seem to make a different judgment to the one that caused the spark of anger at the point of seeing the sort of sums gained.
I was going to say on the small sums, I do think that's actually things that people got upset about was not necessarily the huge sums of money, but actually sort of, even if it was a small amount of money, if it came from a source that people didn't really approve of, that got people really exercised. I mean, when we released this, obviously we got a lot of national coverage, but actually what we also got was a lot of local newspapers sort of taking this. I think we had about 38 different organisations, like the Slough Observer and people, and they were able to sort of drill into their individual sort of constituents MPs and say, why have you taken, even if it's sort of, a few thousand, why have you taken a few thousand to go to Qatar? Why have you taken sort of football tickets from the gambling industry? These were small sums of money, but it was more the question of why are you taking any money from these? Why are you going off and sort of going to free cricket matches?
Interesting. All right, so what do we not know now? What, Cat, are the questions that the Westminster accounts haven't yet begun to answer, and you think that if we try to look at the data in our politics all over again, we would want to learn?
Well, the problem is that we can only know what has been published. We can't know what hasn't. There are lots of known unknowns, and there are some unknown unknowns as well. So I know, for example, from work that I've done previously, that some MPs have what they call a community account, which they don't publish if the money goes into that, because they use it for local things like running jobs fairs and things like that. So how many MPs have community accounts that are going unpublished with money that may be £5 below the threshold and therefore doesn't have to be registered? Again, to my point earlier about Companies House, where does the money ultimately come from when entities are donating? I think that the sort of loophole that enables any company to donate without us actually knowing who the individual was, because of course it's never a company. A company doesn't have a brain. It is an individual at the end of the day. So who are those individuals actually donating, and what is the ultimate origin of it? Particularly when, and again, this was more of a story from before Westminster accounts really, but I think has kind of lingered and rumbled on throughout the year, when you have people who were wealthy Russians and are now UK citizens. How clean is that money ultimately? These are the kind of questions that I think need to be asked in a sort of wider thing. And there is also this other question around unincorporated associations, which is another one of these slightly, perhaps deliberately, boringly named groups, a bit like APPGs, that sort of act as a sort of middle entity in which money goes in and money then comes out. But it adds a layer of opacity in our system.
Sam, what do you not know?
I'm going to be really rude. I think that's the wrong question. And the reason I think that's the wrong question is that we created something big and new, but what we did was we spent a lot of time looking at it. And I think the great danger is that we're looking for the next thing to add on top, rather than just let's keep looking at what we've built, because what we've built is new and is giving us new information all the time. The most interesting time to look at what we've already built is the run-up to an election. Actually, what I'm interested in is campaign finance. What happens now? The Westminster Accounts project, when it was launched, because of when it was launched in the January of 2023, effectively looked at politics in peacetime. We are about to enter war. the political war of the 2024 general election, whenever that may be, probably the end of the year. And that is going to mean that we're at the business end of people donating, the business end of people looking for second jobs, the business end of individuals getting money from slightly opaque places. Rather than seeking the new bit of the tool, the add-on, actually, I think the first thing that we need to do is go, well, actually, we asked quite a lot of the right questions, and that's what we've got to drill in, because now is the time that the tool and the journalism is more important than ever. And yes, there are things, bolt-ons and stuff that we can do, but as we said earlier, the data opens the doors to the stories. Let's not stop looking at the data and opening the doors.
No, well, I'm going to be even more rude, which is going to be to answer the question that I shouldn't have asked myself, because I think there is something, Sam, in trying to figure out what we don't know now. Not in the sense of saying, oh, well, we've done that job, pat ourselves on the back and move on. You're completely right. There's actually something incredibly valuable about trying to understand the same data sets over time. You begin to see the patterns. And as you say, I completely get your point, which is, money in politics in 2023 is going to be fundamentally different from money in politics in 2024. But I have to say that I feel as though we've got a chunk of the Westminster accounts, but if you like, accounting a whole corporation, I don't feel as though we've got the whole Palace of Westminster. And by that, I would say House of Lords. There's obviously a real complexity around disclosure in the House of Lords. Their engagement in politics is different. Their outside interests are different and huge. I think that one of the issues that we still have to get to is the issue that you raised about not assuming the intentions, but understanding the connections. So, for example, donors in the property and real estate sector have always been disproportionately high. How do you then begin to understand what planning decisions are made by parts of government? And this may not just be at a national level, it may be at a local level. And what's the relationship between donors, if you like, and government business? And another thing that I think has been really hard to get at, and this is not possibly Westminster accounts, it may be sort of more kind of Whitehall diaries, is understanding time and access. Who in the one database gets to play, in the diary of the other, i.e. Westminster, Whitehall. And then I've got this final question, which is about honours. So I think that we still don't fully understand the relationship between donations and our honours system. And so that's what I meant more by what we don't know now. Not that the data set itself kind of leaves too much in the dark. It's just that there are whole other sets of data that I think would give us a fuller picture.
Yeah. No, there's definitely new and more and different, and each one requires the same level of thought and engagement, and the question is, where is this is the most difficult thing about the Westminster accounts from the start has always been, what do you guess is the best return for your risk of investment of a huge amount of time? Which bit of that is going to tell you the most surprising, most revelatory story? And some people say it's a giant fishing expedition. Yes, it is. That's what it is. It's sort of unashamedly throwing things out, because previously you weren't allowed to go fishing. You weren't allowed to have any fun at all. And just working out where we go next.
Just on that, but Cat and Sam, I'm intrigued to know the sort of gossipy end of this. How much pushback did you get in the lobby from MPs saying, why are you doing this? This isn't helpful. You're not, understanding the way in which this works, or...
There are still a couple of MPs that I haven't
confidence.
spoken to since. One accused me of trying to ruin his life, and we've not spoken since the day that Westminster Accounts tool was published. So,
did you have any of that, Sam?
Yeah, we ended some relationships, and we can think some of the thoughts were unfair, fair. That some people felt picked on, some people felt that the system treated them badly, but it was it was an inevitability and something that you knew was likely to happen. But the thing about the project I always came back to is that there was never any inaccuracy in the tool or the journalism. Through the whole of Westminster accounts, going up online, and all the journalism, something that we did at Sky, there has never been one kind of meaningful complaint or anything up until now there's ever been problematic.
And actually, it's worth saying, one of the things that I thought was really good in the process of figuring out with Sky was actually working out what's the mechanism by which someone who is an MP can go back and say, hang on, you've got this wrong. Because as often as not, if there was a problem, it was a problem in the declaration rather than in the kind of putting together of data. So let me just finish up with a kind of election year question. Do you think that money will play a part in the outcome of the general election?
So slightly picking up on what Sam has already said, but I think that this is a slight chicken and an egg question, because I think as much as you see the polls shift, you also see donation trends shift. And Labour has become suddenly, over the last 18 months, very donatable, and the Conservatives less so. And that is not necessarily because people are thinking that they might be able to influence things, but just that suddenly Labour seems like a much more viable prospect. And therefore, you know, why wouldn't you? If you believe in the project and the sort of broad kind of thrust of what they're doing, and yes, perhaps have some hope that they might look favourably on you when it comes to shaping policy, then that seems to be a much more plausible thing to do.
And Sam, there's a story in that too, isn't there, which is that the visibility enabled by the Westminster accounts helps voters understand where the sentiment of donors is. It's actually a poll, if you like.
That's right. And yeah, of course it's going to make a difference. Let me give you the difference will be in the disparity. So last year, in 2023, the Tories raised something in the region of 100 million quid overall. Now that's going to be spent over a long period of time on a number of different things. Definitely pre-campaign, where there are much tighter rules on what you can spend. Labour did not raise anything like that over that period. Now they might, be able to raise the 30 odd million. Both Labour and the Tory party might both be able to raise the 30 odd million for the short campaign, but the Liberal Democrats won't. It's not clear that the SNP will. So there, straight off, is a absolutely concrete example of where there will be masses more advertising literature targeted in a far more meaningful and specific way at voter groups that some political parties and not others think will be absolutely vital in lending them support, or if they're more likely to vote for Labour or more likely to vote for an opposition party, stay at home. That's the big bit where politics makes a difference, where there are disparities. And whilst we don't yet know the size of the disparity between Labour and the Tories, we know for certain there'll be a disparity between the Tories and the Liberal Democrats, the Tories and the SNP. So that's your answer.
Interesting. Let me finish with you, Joe, and I hope you're not going to think this is a suggestion, it genuinely is a question. People say that about 4 billion people will go to the polls in 2024. How easy or difficult would it be to take the model of the Westminster accounts and transpose it to elections from India to the United States to South Africa to Taiwan to on and on and on? How possible is it to take the model that's been built between Sky and Tortoise and see whether you could do that for democracy globally?
So I would say, having spent a lot of time criticising how opaque our system is and it's not very well put together, you look at other countries, and actually the UK, does better than a lot of countries. I mean, we actually did have a look at sort of, was this viable for Canada? And we realised actually the information they make available would not allow you to have anywhere near the level of granularity that you have for the UK. So actually, I think it'd be quite difficult, and that is, in a sense, as much as I think the UK system can be improved, there is also the fact that they do have to record quite a lot, made this project possible in the first place.
Right, well, we're not going to ask you to do it by the end of the week, but it's definitely something to try and figure out. Sam Coates, thanks very much for coming in. I appreciate you coming over to the Tortoise newsroom. And actually, I should say, I really appreciated working with Sky on this. When we started this thing, couldn't quite conceive of how would an organisation like yours that is up to date and on the news every minute work with ours, a slow one that's trying to see how these trends develop. But actually, the joy of it was exactly that, slow and fast. So thank you for being here. Cat, thank you too. I think you're headed off to investigate one aspect of the politics that might well shape 2024. And Joe, I appreciate your deep in it for Westminster Accounts 2024. So it's very good. Very, very good to have you with us. Thanks very much. Thank you for listening. If you've got views on not just politics and money, but how we can use data to improve our journalism and understanding, do just message the news meeting at tortoisemedia.com. Thank you for listening, and look forward to you joining us for the next news meeting. Thanks very much.